something shocking happened in China in 1989 that the government has tried to erase from history. Chinese students rose up demanding democracy and freedom, leading to one of the largest protests in China's history. It all began with the death of a beloved reformer named Hu Yaobang, who wanted to bring more openness to China. What followed was a struggle between idealistic students and a government determined to maintain control. The government's response would shock the world and change China's path forever. To this day, the Chinese Communist Party erases this history, claiming nothing happened on June 4, 1989. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to when Mao Zedong, founder of Communist China, died in 1976. Mao's policies had led to economic disaster and a violent cultural revolution. After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping rose to power with a different vision for China. Deng wanted economic reforms, opening China to the world and embracing some capitalism. He was inspired by Singapore, an authoritarian state that had achieved economic success. Deng appointed his protégé Hu Yaobang as Party General Secretary, the second highest position in China. Together, they brought rapid changes to China throughout the 1980s. But problems emerged. In 1986, students protested corruption and unfair job allocation. Hu Yaobang sympathized with the students and refused to crack down on them. This angered Deng and other hardliners, who forced Hu to resign in 1987. Zhao Ziyang took Hu's place, but surprisingly, he also sympathized with reforms. Meanwhile, Premier Li Peng represented the hardline faction opposed to political reforms. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang suffered a heart attack during a meeting and died. Students began gathering at Tiananmen Square to mourn the man they saw as a champion of reform. University posters appeared calling for democracy and freedom, values Hu had supported. What began as mourning quickly evolved into calls for the government to continue Hu's reforms. Students wanted freedom of speech, an end to corruption, and more democracy. The government was caught off guard by how quickly the mourning turned into political demands. Within days, the crowd at Tiananmen Square grew from hundreds to thousands. Student leaders presented 7 demands, including affirming Hu Yaobang's views on democracy. 2 factions formed in the government. Hardliners, led by Li Peng, wanted to crush the protests. Zhao Ziyang advocated dialogue and understanding the students' concerns. When police roughed up some isolated students, news spread and galvanized more to join. By April 21st, the crowd had swelled to more than 50,000 people. On April 22nd, the official memorial for Hu saw 400,000 people gather, the largest unofficial demonstration in Communist China's history. After the memorial, student leaders knelt on the steps of the Great Hall with their demands, but no officials came out. Students then declared an indefinite strike from classes until their demands were met. On April 26th, the government published an editorial condemning the protest as turmoil caused by troublemakers. This harsh stance enraged the students, who saw themselves as patriots trying to improve China. Many students wrote farewell letters before joining the next march, fearing they wouldn't return. On April 27th, 200,000 students marched, while over 1 million citizens lined the streets in support. Remarkably, soldiers brought in to stop the march stood down when confronted by such numbers. International media began covering the growing movement extensively. A major turning point came in May, when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was scheduled to visit Beijing. Students announced a hunger strike beginning May 13th, 2 days before Gorbachev's arrival. About 1,000 students began fasting, demanding their movement be recognized as patriotic. The hunger strike struck an emotional chord with ordinary Chinese citizens, who began joining in greater numbers. Gorbachev's welcoming ceremony had to be moved to the airport, a major embarrassment for the government. During meetings, tensions grew between Zhao and Deng over how to handle the crisis. Deng was furious that the protests continued and blamed Zhao for supporting the students. On May 17, Deng decided there was no option but to declare martial law. Zhao considered resigning but was convinced not to, taking a leave of absence instead. On May 19, Zhao made his last public appearance, visiting the hunger strikers in the square. "We came too late," he told them, urging them to end their hunger strike and leave. Zhao bowed to the students in respect, his final public act before being placed under house arrest. The next day, Li Peng announced martial law and 250,000 troops prepared to enter Beijing. In response, approximately 1.2 million people flooded into the square in defiance. Citizens formed human barricades at entry points to the city, preventing troops from entering. Some soldiers from Beijing couldn't bring themselves to use force against the people they knew. After a 4-day standoff, the military withdrew to regroup outside the city. Protesters saw this as a victory, believing the tide had turned in their favor. But the government was bringing in soldiers from distant provinces who had no connection to Beijing residents. By June 2nd, troops began covertly entering the city in civilian clothes. Weapons and equipment were secretly transported into the Great Hall of the People. Deng gave the final order, authorizing troops to use all necessary means to clear the square. On June 3rd, the government issued warnings for citizens to stay away from the square. Instead, Beijing residents flooded the streets once more, hoping to prevent military action. At 8 p.m. on June 3rd, the military assault began along Chang'an Avenue. Initial clashes involved tear gas and rubber bullets, while protesters threw rocks and bottles. After warnings were ignored, soldiers fired warning shots into the air. At 10:10 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Soldiers began firing directly into the crowds. Tanks began ramming through barricades with no regard for human life. Shocked civilians couldn't believe their own army was firing live ammunition at unarmed citizens. By 1:30 a.m. on June 4th, troops had reached Tiananmen Square from multiple directions. Student leaders debated whether to stay or leave, ultimately deciding to evacuate to save lives. Most students who survived were allowed to leave through the southeast corner of the square. At 5:23 a.m., a tank crushed the Goddess of Democracy statue that students had erected. By dawn on June 4th, the military had complete control of Tiananmen Square. Parents and family members desperately searched for their missing loved ones. This is when the famous tank man scene occurred, a lone man standing in front of a column of tanks. He climbed onto the tank, reportedly asking the drivers where they were going and why they were there. He was eventually led away by bystanders, and his identity and fate remain unknown. Foreign journalists risked their lives to smuggle footage out of China, hiding film in teapots and other containers. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded and dead as military forces tried to control information. The death toll remains disputed. The Chinese government claims only 200 died, while some estimates go as high as 10,000. Zhao Ziyang remained under house arrest until his death in 2005, punished for his sympathy toward the students. The military crackdown extended beyond Beijing to other cities where protests had erupted. In the following weeks, the government arrested thousands of people associated with the protests. Some student leaders managed to escape China through an underground network called Operation Yellowbird. The Chinese government labeled the entire movement a counter-revolutionary riot. In China today, the events of 1989 have been systematically erased from history books. Keywords related to the protests are heavily censored on Chinese internet and social media. Until recently, Hong Kong was the only place in China where people could openly commemorate the massacre. But even Hong Kong's annual vigil has now been banned under the national security law. After 1989, the CCP made an unspoken deal with its citizens, economic prosperity, in exchange for political obedience. Today's China has combined economic success with an unprecedented surveillance state. Under Xi Jinping, the party has further consolidated power and eliminated the term limits. An entire generation has grown up without knowledge of what happened in Tiananmen Square. The families of victims still quietly seek acknowledgement and justice for their loved ones. While the Chinese government claims nothing happened, the world remembers the courage of those who stood up. The Tiananmen Square crackdown shocked the world and led to international sanctions against China. Many Western countries imposed arms embargoes that remain in place today. China was diplomatically isolated for years afterward, but gradually rebuilt its international standing. The government doubled down on economic development while maintaining strict political control. Some protesters spent decades in prison, only being released in their old age. A group called the Tiananmen Mothers, formed by parents of victims, continues to seek accountability. Outside China, annual vigils commemorate the massacre in cities worldwide. The spirit of Tiananmen continues to inspire Chinese democracy activists and human rights defenders. But speaking about June 4th within China remains one of the most dangerous political acts. Search engines and social media platforms in China filter out all references to the events. Artists and writers outside China have created works to ensure the events are not forgotten. Today's China is vastly different from 1989, wealthier and more powerful, but with even tighter controls. New technologies allow for unprecedented levels of surveillance and control. Yet the desire for freedom and justice continues in new forms of resistance. Journalists and historians continue to piece together what happened that night. Many Chinese learn about Tiananmen only when they travel or study abroad. What would the students of 1989 think of China today? Their dreams of political reform remain unfulfilled. While political protests are crushed, economic grievances sometimes lead to localized demonstrations. Some who remember find subtle ways to commemorate the anniversary each year. Human rights organizations continue to call for accountability for the Tiananmen massacre. The Tank Man remains one of history's most powerful symbols of resistance against overwhelming force. Today, Tiananmen Square shows no trace of the bloodshed that occurred there. But as one survivor said, the truth cannot be erased from history forever. We remember June 4th, 1989, a day the Chinese government says never happened. If you found this video insightful, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth content like this.